I'm gonna start this off by saying that I've always been more of a Marvel person, and I still am more of a Marvel person. Their characters, to me, I prefer them a lot more. I'm gonna get more into that. Their video games. DC has Superman 64 and Aquaman, two of the worst games of all time. And as far as good games, it's really just Batman and Injustice, while Marvel has like 8 great fighting games in the Marvel Capcom series alone. The Spider-Man games, it's not really a competition in my opinion. And throughout history, Marvel has had better games, to me. TV shows is pretty neck and neck. I give it to Marvel though. Daredevil, one of my favorites. Animation, definitely DC. They got the better writing there, but Marvel does have some entertaining shows, and I find them more entertaining, like the Spider-Man cartoons. Animated movies though, Marvel, you really need to step that shit up because it's not even close. Not even. Because I could see Marvel catching up in the animation, but as far as movies, good luck. Live action movies, it's pretty close because DC has had a long history of live action films, but I still give it to Marvel. I mean, I just saw Endgame. But when it comes to comics, and although most of my favorite comics happen to be Marvel comics, DC is where it's at when it comes to comics. And there's a few reasons for that. Let me just start off with the most personal reason for me. I don't like single issues. They're a mess. They're slippery when you board them up. They get damaged easily. They're hard to collect. They're expensive. There's variants. It's just a confusing mess to have single issues. And as fun as it is reading them, and as cool as the 2-page spreads look on them, it's really nothing compared to having a trade paperback with the spine that you can put on your shelf, pull it out, and read it. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because DC, and it's funny because this isn't really even a good example of that. Well, I guess it is. Here's a perfect example, actually. DC, when they write, and I don't know if it's a mandate or what, but they just seem to know how to release self-contained stories as volumes, even if it's in a long-running series. They make an arc that is standalone that could be consumed in a volume with like what, 4 to 12 issues. This is 1 through 9 right here. While Marvel, their approach is just write whatever the fuck you want, and we'll release it in a trade paperback with numbering. They do obviously at times do the same thing as DC. They'll take a certain amount of issues and put them in one trade paperback. Kraven's Last Hunt, whatnot, Daredevil, Born Again, stuff like that. Doctor Strange, Flight of Bones, stuff like that. But you see how I kind of had to struggle to name them? Batman alone has so many self-contained trade paperback stories, that collected stories, that I can name much more of those than I can with Marvel in rapid fire succession. And that's the sad thing. That's one thing I really don't like. For trade readers and for trade readers like myself who prefer this, it's a lot harder to get into Marvel stuff. And here's kind of a segue to that. DC has Vertigo, and in the 80s specifically, they had what was known as the British invasion of writers. They took these UK experimental comic book writers like Alan Moore, creator of Watchmen, V for Vendetta, 2 standalones, coincidentally. Grant Morrison, who he does do more of the volume stuff, I'll give him that, but he does have stuff like Arkham Asylum, which is a Batman one-shot, which is an actual graphic novel. This has nothing to do with the video, but I'm gonna break this down. It's just something. If you collect a comic book issue, like issue 1 through 9 of Justice League, it's a comic book. And when you collect it into this, it's a trade. Graphic novels are one thing, and I feel that the term graphic novel is used to kind of demean comics and kind of just to like shy away from the stigma that comics have, and I find the term very disrespectful. I'm gonna make a video on that later. Okay, back to the topic. Actually forgot it. No, just kidding. DC had the British invasion of writers, and in the 80s they shook the industry. They had stuff like Animal Man, which broke the fourth wall. Watchmen, which gave a realistic, gritty interpretation of what heroes would be like today, and it told a powerful story. Then you had Sandman, a trippy, freaking trip into the dream, trip into the dream world. I haven't read shit on Sandman, but I've seen parts of it. I've seen the arts. I've heard certain things about it. I'm going to read it eventually. You had The Invisibles, and a lot of these are from Vertigo, which is a line of DC comics that are pretty much not really part of the DC universe. Sandman kind of is, and they usually tell standalone, self-contained stories that could be bought in a few volumes or one volume that are generally a lot more serious. And I'm not one of these people who say DC's better because it's dark, because the real dark stuff from DC is from Vertigo. As far as main continuity shit, it's just as dark. I've read both. It's not that much different. And Marvel, they do have Icon Comics, which is more recent, where they do have writers doing a similar thing, writing out of continuity stuff, stories that are a little more out there and mature. They have Kick-Ass, which is one of the darkest fucking things I've read. It's a black comedy, really. Another realistic take on superheroes. Nowhere near as nuanced as Watchmen. But Mark Millar, that's kind of expected from Mark Millar, who I am a fan of. And they got stuff like Powers and Kingsman, but those names compared to V for Vendetta and Sandman and Watchmen, like it's not even a comparison. And the unfortunate thing is, unlike other writers, regular comic book writers like Peter David and whatnot, who work for both companies, these guys are very, very, very partial. A lot of them are very, very partial to DC. Alan Moore and Grant Morrison specifically. Alan Moore has only really written, like, I believe it was 2 or 3 issues for Captain Britain. Yeah, some of you probably don't even know who that is. And 4 pages of X-Men. Meanwhile, he's written tons of stuff for DC. Grant Morrison, I'll give him that he wrote a 40-something issue run on X-Men, which is one of my favorite runs in comics. And he wrote a few issues of Fantastic Four and a few issues of Marvel Boy. But that's it. Compared to what he did at DC, I don't know how many volumes this is, but I know it's like at least 5. Which is about what New X-Men is. New X-Men, yeah, it's like 5 or 6. He has this, he has stuff on Superman. There's just too much to list. You could look it up yourself. And Grant Morrison happens to be my favorite writer in comics. Him and Frank Miller are up there. And believe it or not, yes, Frank Miller is more of a Marvel guy, and I prefer his Marvel stuff is better than his DC stuff to me. Frank Miller. And the Daredevil run is my favorite run. His original Daredevil run is my favorite run in comics. But back to the topic. They got better writers, and they keep them. They know how to keep their talent. DC kind of did some fucked up shit, actually. Back in the 2000s, DC would call writers who were writing for Marvel and would say, hey, we got this exclusive deal for you. We'll pay you a crap ton of money, but you got to leave right now and come for us right now. And many writers who were working at Marvel left Marvel mid-book while writing a book. They dropped the book and just fucked over Marvel and left for the money. And they've kept a lot of exclusive writers like Jeff Johns and whatnot. I believe Jeff Johns might have been one of them. And he's one of the more notable writers. He wrote Shazam, which is pretty much what the movie is based on. Almost 70% of the movie is from that comic book. Great stuff. He's a great writer as well. But they just know how to keep their talent. And it's another unfortunate thing. This is a little lesser victory for DC, but they have Brian Bolland, who worked for Marvel for a few issues. He's more of a cover artist, which is why I say it's a small victory. He only did a few things in Marvel, and he just like had a bad experience with them and never worked for them again. And he's the artist of The Killing Joke, another Alan Moore standalone story. And the final reason, which is a pretty big reason, DC keeps it traditional. And that's one reason why I don't like DC as much as Marvel. Their characters are very traditional. It's the underwear over there, the suit, the spandex, the cape, and sidekicks, specifically sidekicks. It's just very like, what the fuck? Like, it's just very dated and old, and it's not as relatable as the more realistic Marvel heroes, for the most part. But because they keep it traditional, and they don't fall into fads as much as Marvel, they've remained a lot more consistent. DC falls into fads as well. They do have certain SJW issues, but Marvel has a lot more. A lot more. And it's worse. And I'm not gonna be unfair and say that I've read most of these SJW or things that are claimed to be SJWs. I've heard Spider-Gwen was a SJW comic. From what I've read so far, it doesn't seem very SJW. It's just an alternate universe, but with gender swaps, which have been done before, and this is doing it well. But when it was done before, it wasn't really considered SJW. And I have read a very SJW shit from Batman, Scott Snyder's run, the in-between issues between arcs with Cullen, super SJW. The most SJW thing I've read, actually. But from what I've seen, Marvel has a lot more of that. The 90s. The 90s, what was in was edgy, weird freaking edgy costumes with pouches and weird muscles, bad anatomy. The art in the 90s, a lot of it was weak. DC had some of this as well. They had terrible redesigns. They had terrible costumes, just like Marvel. Marvel had it a little worse, obviously, with the costume redesigns. We still had Azrael Batman, one of the worst costumes ever. You had some hideous looking shit at DC. And you had some cringe comics too. But Marvel had a lot more of the cringe because they had guys like Rob Liefeld. And Marvel was a lot about the cheddar back then. In case you didn't know, they were... Alright, I had a little bit of misinformation. Basically, Marvel in the 90s was bought out by a company headed by Ron Perelman, and Ron Perelman fucked up the company. He treated comics, instead of as an art form, instead of as literature, yes, literature, as art, he treated it as collectibles. So he'd do the holographic covers, the variant covers. He'd do a bunch of gimmicks to sell comics, to make people buy, resetting comics to number one. They both do this, but Marvel did it a lot worse. And DC, as a result, had better comics in the 90s. And I'm not saying Marvel, everything at Marvel was bad in the 90s. I'm just saying a lot of it was, more so than DC. This is one. See, I don't even like this art, really. I don't like long-haired Superman. I hate this Green Lantern costume. It looks hideous in my opinion. And the art, to me, is very 90s, and I'm not a fan of it. But it's Grant Morrison, and the writing is just a lot more top-notch. So yeah, Marvel falls in... So to sum it up, DC keeps it more traditional, while Marvel falls more into fads. And they double down on these fads a lot more than DC. The SJW fad currently, the cringe 90s fad. 2000s was a great era for Marvel. Which is good. Which I'm happy, actually. I'm happy for that. DC has the British Invasion writers and the Vertigo line of comics, and they have a better strategy with trade paperbacks. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I'm still more attached to Marvel. I don't prefer Marvel, actually. I like them both in comics. I don't prefer Marvel in comics. Let me retract that, because DC has such great writing. But I prefer their characters, and most of my favorite stuff happens to be Marvel. But I could agree that DC has the better comics. And as more of a Marvel, as a guy who grew up with Marvel and was more into Marvel, it sucks to say it, but I still prefer Marvel overall, like I said, from the stuff in the beginning. And yeah, thank you for watching. And forget T-Series, forget PewDiePie, subscribe to Comic Tropes. A lot of the knowledge I got from this is from his channel. And I basically got back into comics because of him. So I want you to check out his channel and subscribe to him. Link in the description below. He really could use your support. And if you want to learn anything about comics, he's the #1 guy. So yeah, thanks for watching. And yeah, I might actually be doing more comic book stuff on this channel. So yeah, have a good one, guys. Thanks for watching.